Hi, everybody. In Chapter 29 in your textbook, The Cold War, Global Conflict, Cold War, and New Directions. It's an aptly named title because, of course, when the Americans set off the atomic bomb in Japan, war and diplomacy and politics as we know it sort of ended. There were a lot of anxieties in that era, particularly about the amount of territory that Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union controlled. You have to keep in mind that as soon as the Nazis surrendered, these issues, these anxieties, these conflicts came into absolute light, and they became priority for the Americans and for the Soviets because the post-war settlement was quite controversial. The Allies had roughly agreed to only be military allies and to leave the political questions alone for the moment. However, one of the things they did agree upon was the denazification of Germany, where all people who had been active in the Nazi movement would no longer be able to be involved in politics in Germany whatsoever. There was even a serious discussion of completely deindustrializing Germany, of stripping it of all its factories and all of its industrial infrastructure and reducing it to sort of a third world type agricultural economy. However, the United States soon, very quickly, puts these thoughts out of mind, although they don't necessarily tell the Soviets that, because the primary stressor, the primary objective after the Second World War is for America to get as many allies and to expand its sphere of influence as far as possible. Ironically, the Americans have been against the idea of sphere of influence, but now, at the end of the war, when they and the Soviet Union are really the only two countries standing that are strong enough to do anything or to be world powers, that expanding the sphere of influence becomes the primary goal. European powers are going to have to let go of their colonies because they're simply exhausted and broke, and there's so much destruction in Europe after the Second World War that they're no longer capable of truly being world leaders. Instead, Western Europe, for the most part, lines up with the United States against the Soviet Union. There are some exceptions, of course. Right away on page 742, you see that in France and in Italy, there was a growth of large popular communist parties that began to run in elections after the Second World War is over. Now, the question for Americans is, are we going to allow this to happen? On one hand, we really do stand up for democracy and freedom in the world. On the other hand, we don't want to allow freedom to result into communists being elected, which probably would have happened. It's a pretty certain thing that in Italy and perhaps even in France too, communist politicians would have been elected in the late 1940s. However, an organization called the Organization of the OSS transfers into the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, and the CIA starts to get involved with proactively preventing something like this from happening. Officially, the Central Intelligence Agency is charged with gathering intelligence. However, it soon becomes apparent that the CIA agents are actively or proactively getting involved in foreign affairs, actively carrying out secret missions and so forth. So one of the things they do, even though your textbook doesn't say this, is that in Italy, for example, the CIA, through some dummy corporations, through some fronts, buy up newspapers and start radio stations and hire journalists and intellectuals to write books against communism. They fund a whole lot of propaganda and even, interfere in the election to prevent Italy and France from going communist. So this is going to establish a pattern that exists up to this day, where American intelligence agents do, plant themselves in communities. They not only spy, but they also carry out covert missions. The rule here, of course, is plausible deniability. That if you're a CIA agent in the field, you don't have to be an American. You can be an Italian CIA agent. In 1967 in Bolivia, the Che Guevara, the Cuban communist revolutionary, is killed by Bolivian and Cuban CIA agents. So, it's definitely something that is an active part of the Cold War world, and of course still exists to this day. Now, Americans conceptualize the Cold War mission of stopping communist expansion, or as they call it, communist aggression. And the communists, of course, were aggressive, not to the extent that we ever thought. We'll get to that. In the idea of containment. Containment was a set of ideas codified by an American diplomat named George Kennan, who only died recently. And by the way, he was quite alarmed at what the American government did to his idea of containment. But containment says that the purpose of American policy after World War II is to resist the extension of Soviet expansion and influence in the expectation that eventually the Soviet Union will collapse from internal pressures and the burdens of its foreign oppression. Now, of course, the Soviet Union does eventually collapse, starting in about 1989, 90, 91, because of its own internal economic difficulties. Ronald Reagan, of course, did not cause the Soviet Union to collapse. He helped it along with the arms spending that he forced the Soviets into. But the Soviet economy was on a steady decline from the late 1950s all the way up. And as a matter of fact, that's the main reason why Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, falls from power in 1964, because he can't get the economy back on an even keel. So the containment is paired with the Truman Doctrine, and this is a pretty fateful decision America makes. This is very important. In 1947, England had been propping up the royalist government, the monarchy, and the government in Greece against communist insurgents. And in 1947, England informs the United States that it can no longer afford to support Greece. And so the Americans, President Truman, decided to ask Congress to funds to provide support for the governments in Greece and Turkey. And Congress, of course, gives out $40 million to help to uphold the governments in Greece and in Turkey. Now, why this is a big deal and why this is a really change in direction, a very important decision the American government makes, is that we are officially wanting to spread democracy and free market capitalism throughout the world, especially democracy. However, the Greek government is a right-wing military dictatorship. It is not a democratic government. So here we clearly see the Cold War containment strategy triumphing even over democracy. Democracy becomes less important. What becomes more important is stopping communism. Now, the fateful thing about this is, of course, and this is a pattern that also develops, that the Greek government had collaborated with the Nazis in World War II. And so, therefore, after the war is over with, it had very little legitimacy in the eyes of people in Greece. So it wasn't only communists helping to fight against the government. It was actually a coalition led by communists. And this is something we're going to see again and again in Korea and Vietnam and other places, and Cuba and many other places. So we decided to support an anti-democratic government to stop communism, and this is then turned around into what's known as the Marshall Plan, there on page 743. George C. Marshall, the Chief of Staff of the United States Army in World War II, makes this speech where he says that it is America's fault that Nazism arose and did what it did, because we were isolationists in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and we allowed these totalitarian ideologies, plural, Nazism and communism, to arise. So therefore, after the war, we need to stop being isolationist, to get out in the world, to be a player in the international game, and to stop the expansion of totalitarian ideologies. So America, under the Marshall Plan, offers financial, economic, and all kinds of aid to any countries that ask for it. Marshall says that the reason that totalitarian ideologies like Nazism and communism spread is because of economic depression, because of joblessness, because of poverty, because of hunger, because of want, because of instability. So therefore, the Marshall Plan will loan money to Europe and other places that ask for it to help them to rebuild after the war and to stop the spread of communism. We even offer the Marshall Plan money to the Soviets, but of course they don't want it. They've got their own version of this. After we offer ours, they offer theirs. So clearly the world is dividing up in between these bipolar poles of Soviets and Americans. Now, of course, the Marshall Plan has some strings attached to it. If you take this aid, you have to pay it back with interest. And, of course, American companies often do the reconstruction work. Americans have the right to sell their manufactured goods, so it's very good for the American economy. And it provides that post-war economic boom that we know and miss so well. Also, of course, we don't have any competition. In the economic sphere, the economies of Europe and Asia are destroyed, and they don't recover for a long time, so we pretty much have no competition. When the competition comes back in the 60s and 70s, when Japan and West Germany and so forth start to have an increased industrial output and productivity, then, of course, our economy sort of goes downhill. But for a long time, the Marshall Plan is a very good thing. Of course, with Marshall Plan funds, you also have to accept military bases and other restrictions. So, you know, it is definitely an attempt for America to expand its sphere of influence.